They built an engine so wild, so brutally powerful, it made veteran mechanics flinch. The kind of machine that doesn't just make noise, it screams, shakes the ground, and burns itself into your memory. This is the 446 Gurney Eagle. And what happened to it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about racing history. Imagine a small California workshop outsmarting Detroit's biggest minds. Imagine a garage-built engine beating multi-million-dollar programs. Imagine corporate suits getting nervous. In 1970, Ford had a problem. Not with Ferrari, not with Chevy, but with one of their own. Dan Gurney, racing icon and engineering maverick, had created a monster. A 600-horsepower V8 so advanced it made Ford's flagship engines look like toys, and instead of celebrating it, Ford buried it. No ban, no press release, just silence, like it never existed. But whispers survived, in pit lanes, in hot rod garages, among old-timers who remember the roar. So why did Ford turn its back on a masterpiece? Was it too powerful, too expensive, or was it the man behind it, Dan Gurney, who threatened the corporate order? This isn't just an engine story, it's a war story. A quiet war between passion and profit, between risk and reputation, between a man with a vision and a company that couldn't handle it. We're diving into a story of genius betrayed. A story where garage passion clashed with boardroom politics. A story whispered about in racing circles for decades. It's got everything: speed, secrets, sabotage. Because this isn't just about horsepower, it's about fear, control, and a dream engine too good for the status quo. If it had survived, the Gurney Eagle 4046 might have changed everything: IndyCar, Can-Am, even street racing, but Ford made sure it didn't. So buckle up. Because the truth behind the Gurney Eagle 446 isn't just shocking, it's the kind of story that makes you wonder how many other legends got buried by boardrooms. Before we talk about the engine, we need to talk about the man. Because without Dan Gurney, there is no 446. Dan wasn't just a racer, he was a rebel, a dreamer in a fireproof suit. Born in 1931 in Port Jefferson, New York, Dan came from a family of brilliance. His father sang opera at the Met, his uncles were MIT engineers, and his grandfather invented a ball bearing still used in machines today. But Dan? He liked noise, speed, danger. In 1948, his family moved to Riverside, California, ground zero for the hot rod scene. At just 19, he built his first race car and took it to the Bonneville Salt Flats. He hit 138 mpg. That was his start. By the 60s, Dan was a legend. He won Le Mans in a Ford GT40, beat Ferrari and, here's the big one, won the 1967 Belgian Grand Prix in a car he designed himself. No American had ever done that before. He was the first to spray champagne on the podium. That was Dan. But for Gurney, racing wasn't enough. He wanted to build, to innovate, to show that American engineering could go toe-to-toe with Europe's best. In interviews, Gurney often spoke about efficiency, not flash. He once said, "If you're not improving something, you're just wasting fuel." That mindset, relentless improvement, defined him. He wasn't chasing trophies, he was chasing breakthroughs. So in 1965, he founded All American Racers, AAR, alongside Carroll Shelby. Their mission? Build race cars and engines in the US that could dominate globally. It wasn't just about winning, it was about pride, about proving something. And Dan wasn't in it for the money. He wanted perfection, power without compromise. He believed engines weren't just machines, they were art, loud, fast, temperamental art, and his masterpiece was yet to come. He envisioned a V8 so precise, so ferocious, it could shake up IndyCar and beyond. And from that vision came the 446 Gurney Eagle. But building it meant challenging the giants, Ford included. Dan wasn't afraid, but maybe he should have been. Because in the world of motorsport, visionaries don't always win. The 446 Gurney Eagle wasn't built in a lab. It was forged in workshops, in sweat, in genius. A Frankenstein of innovation, assembled piece by piece across continents. It started with a Ford small block V8, familiar, rugged, but Dan wanted more. He teamed up with Harry Westlake, the British engineer behind Jaguar's racing dominance, Westlake's secret weapon. Cylinder heads so well designed they turned air into acceleration. The engine's block was cast in Ford's Cleveland foundry in Ohio, a monster of iron ready to be awakened. Then it traveled to Michigan, where workers drilled it with surgeon-like precision. The heads, they were born across the Atlantic. In Rye, England, Westlake's team poured molten aluminum into sand-cast molds, carving steep downdraft intakes and heart-shaped combustion chambers. Each head was hand-finished, not built, crafted. Hours went into port polishing alone. Every curve mattered. Every surface had to sing. The process was so meticulous, one engineer called it machine poetry. Aye. Then came the marriage of metal. At AAR's shop in Santa Ana, California, mechanics bolted Westlake's heads onto Ford's blocks. They added forged pistons, stronger rods, and a custom camshaft built for high RPM carnage. For fuel delivery, Dan went bold: mechanical injection with 8 throttle bodies, finicky but brutally precise. The compression ratio? A fierce 12.5.1. The red line over 8,000 RPM. The result? An engine that sounded like war. On the dyno, it howled. At 535 horsepower in qualifying trim, it dwarfed most street engines of the time. But it wasn't just numbers, it was sensation. A roar like a jet, a scream that vibrated ribs. Mechanic Joe Beosian called it a banshee on fire. Another engineer said tuning it was like taming a hurricane. And the noise? Deafening. Mechanics wore earplugs. Tools rattled off walls. The 4046 didn't just make power, it made a scene. Dan's idea wasn't just to win races, it was to spark a revolution. The plan? Use the 446 to conquer Indy, then sell Westlake heads to Mustang and Falcon owners. Make everyday cars roar like race machines. At $2,000 per head, $15,000 today, it was an expensive dream. Add $1,000 for Weber downdraft carbs, and you had a street legal rocket. But it worked. One Mustang owner in California used a 446 setup to outrun Corvettes at local drag strips. Another squeezed out over 600 horsepower on methanol. The word spread. This engine was the real deal, and it looked the part. The polished aluminum heads, the mechanical injection lines, the raw, purposeful aesthetic. It wasn't just performance. It was presence. This wasn't just an engine, it was a rebellion in aluminum and iron. A rolling middle finger to convention. But rebellions make enemies, and the 446, it was about to find out just how many. In 1968, the Gurney Eagle 446 got its first real shot at glory. And where better than the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the holy ground of American motorsport. Dan Gurney knew the full-sized 446 was too big for IndyCar's regulations, so he downsized it to a 303 cubic inch version. Same fierce DNA, same brilliant Westlake heads, just leaner, lighter, and ready to fly. The car, a low-slung, no-nonsense Eagle Mk3, purpose-built, nimble, and aggressive. Gurney's team brought it to Indy, hoping to prove what raw ingenuity could do against the sport's biggest names and deepest pockets. The result? Shockwaves. That 303-powered Eagle finished second at the 1968 Indy 500, just behind Bobby Unser's turbocharged Offenhauser. And the paddock? They were stunned. Here was a naturally aspirated engine built on a shoestring budget, pushing a car to the front of the pack. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Mechanics whispered about the engine's torque. Drivers talked about how it pulled like a freight train out of corners. Spectators saw something they hadn't in years, an underdog taking on the giants and nearly winning. Even Unser, the winner, admitted Gurney's Eagle was shockingly quick for a non-turbo. Respect flowed through pit lane, and Gurney, he wasn't done. He told reporters this was just the beginning, that the 446, even in its smaller form, could dominate IndyCar if given the chance. Ford's double-overhead cam V8s were expensive, complex, and temperamental. Gurney's engine, lighter, cheaper, and built with passion. In a sport obsessed with dollars, Dan was proving heart still had a place. Fans were excited. Hot rodders dreamed of those Westlake heads. The potential was explosive. More teams started. asking about the engine. Journalists began covering the story. It was momentum, real momentum. But success has a price. That second-place finish turned heads, but not all in a good way. Behind the scenes, rumblings began, corporate discomfort, technical envy, and a quiet realization, if the 446 could do this much with this little, what happens if Gurney really gets funding? The suits were watching, and the storm was coming. After Indy 1968, the mood should have been celebration. Instead, things turned quiet. Too quiet. Gurney's engine had just shocked the world. But Ford, they didn't double down. They didn't expand funding. They didn't even send a congratulatory press release. Instead, whispers emerged that Ford execs were uneasy, that the success of the 446 had ruffled feathers inside the glass towers of Dearborn. The problem wasn't performance, it was politics. The 446 wasn't part of Ford's official plan. It was a rogue operation, a side project. And worse, it made their official double overhead cam V8s look bloated and overpriced. Here was a garage-built engine nearly winning Indy, while Ford's own million-dollar program struggled. Behind closed doors, engineers started raising concerns, not about the engine's power, but its existence. And then came the blockade. Dan had big plans to sell Westlake heads to the public, the same heads that had stunned Indy. He wanted hot rodders and Mustang owners to have access to real race tech. At $2,000 per head, it was a premium, but the demand was real. Ford said no. Not officially, not loudly, just quietly enough to kill momentum. They refused to support mass production, refused to back any public campaign. In a memo, one insider leaked years later, a Ford exec wrote, "Not aligned with brand, strategy. That's corporate speak for we're scared." Scared the 446 might upstage their own engines, scared it might redefine what performance meant for the public, scared that an independent racer was doing what their engineers couldn't. Meanwhile, Gurney was left with crates of unsold heads. Mechanics called the engine the Widowmaker for its power. Hot rodders called it the Outlaw. Some tried to retrofit it into Mustangs, Falcons, even street rods, and on drag strips in California, it left bigger, pricier builds in the dust. And Ford? They called it nothing. Support dried up, test sessions were cancelled, funding slowed. Engineers stopped returning calls. And just like that, a revolutionary engine started gathering dust, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The 446 wasn't outlawed by rules, it was buried by silence, and Gurney's dream was now racing against something even faster than a turbocharged rival, corporate denial. By 1970, Gurney had a choice, give up or go further. He chose the second. If the original 446 was a beast, its next evolution would be something else entirely. Gurney knew to stay relevant, he had to compete with the rising turbocharged monsters. So he turned to his team and said, "Let's make the impossible." The mission, redesign the already insane Westlake heads and create something revolutionary, a 3-valve cylinder head, 2 intakes, 1 exhaust per cylinder. It may sound simple, but this was radical. Most engines at the time ran 2 valves per cylinder. Some had 4, but 3. That was uncharted territory, especially with pushrod architecture. The idea came from Ford's own experimental DOHC engines, which used reversed ports, intake on the outside, exhaust in the center, for better airflow and cooling. Gurney's 3-valve design borrowed that logic, but delivered it with brutal simplicity. The new heads were cast in England with tighter, smoother ports, reduced friction, and 15% better airflow than the 2-valve design. The combustion chambers were recontoured. The compression ratio jumped to 12.51. The fuel system was upgraded with high-pressure Lucas injection. On methanol, the engine screamed past 600 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. The torque curve? Flat, wide, relentless. When they strapped it to the dyno, it snapped the drive shaft. Sparks flew, engineers ducked, but the engine, it didn't even flinch. Test driver Swede Savage took the 3-valve Eagle to Riverside Raceway and later said, "It's like driving a fighter jet. You don't just feel it, you survive it." Spectators saw blue flames shooting from the exhaust at dusk. One kid, in the stands years later, said that sound is why he became a mechanic. The engine came in two versions, a 303 cubic inch version for Indy and a full-fat 446 for Can-Am. In testing, the 303 hit 168 mpm. The 446 pushed past 620 horsepower. It was the peak of Gurney's vision. Beautiful, terrifying, ready to rewrite racing. But there was a problem. Again. Ford wasn't funding it, and without backing, there were only a few prototypes built. The three-valve engines were too expensive for AAR to produce at scale. Most never raced. The 446 had evolved into something extraordinary, but like all legends, it arrived too late. By now you're probably thinking, why would Ford let something this powerful die? Was it just bad timing? Or was it something darker? Officially, Ford said nothing, no press statements, no rule bans, no engine restrictions, just silence. But silence can be strategic. Behind the scenes, rumors were spreading. Gurney's team began suspecting they weren't just being ignored, they were being sabotaged. Blocks arrived from Ford's foundry with tiny imperfections, barely visible cracks. Valve guides machined slightly off-spec. Fuel systems lost in transit. Coincidence? Maybe, but to the mechanics working overtime, it started feeling like death by paper cuts. And then came the memo. Years later, a declassified Ford internal document dated 1970 surfaced. It read, "Gurney engine must not eclipse flagship programs." No names, no context. Just a cold line that sounded a lot like fear disguised as strategy. Inside AAR, there were whispers that rival engineers inside Ford, particularly those leading the official DOHC turbo program, felt threatened. Gurney's engine wasn't just fast, it was independent, and it was doing more with less. If the 446 became a star, what would that say about Ford's expensive pet projects? About the money poured into engines that still hadn't delivered? On the track? And what about the public? Dan had planned to sell the three-valve Westlake heads for street use. Imagine Mustangs making 600 horsepower with bolt-ons. That terrified Ford's marketing department. What would it do to their production car lineup if weekend racers outgunned factory-built GTs? There was no smoking gun, no official blacklist, just funding that disappeared. Parts that arrived late. Phone. Calls that stopped being returned. Ford didn't have to kill the 446, they just had to starve it. Was it sabotage, strategy, or a slow-motion execution under the banner of corporate preservation? Whatever it was, it worked. And Dan Gurney, the man who dared to dream too big, was left with a masterpiece that no one wanted to show. By now, you're probably thinking, why would Ford let something this powerful die? Was it just bad timing? Or was it something darker? Officially, Ford said nothing. No press statements, no rule bans, no engine restrictions, just silence. But silence can be strategic. Behind the scenes, rumors were spreading. Gurney's team began suspecting they weren't just being ignored, they were being sabotaged. Blocks arrived from Ford's foundry with tiny imperfections, barely visible cracks. Valve guides machined slightly off-spec. Fuel systems lost in transit. Minor issues that added up fast. Coincidence? Maybe. But to the mechanics working overtime, it started feeling like death by 1,000 cuts. And then came the memo. Years later, a declassified Ford internal document dated 1970 surfaced. It read, "Gurney engine must not eclipse flagship programs." No names, no context. Just a cold line that sounded a lot like fear disguised as strategy. Inside AR, there were whispers that rival engineers inside Ford, particularly those leading the official DOHC turbo project, felt threatened. Gurney's engine wasn't just fast, it was independent, and it was doing more with less. If the 446 became a star, what would that say about Ford's expensive pet projects? About the money poured into engines that still hadn't delivered? On the track, there was more. Gurney planned to sell the three-valve Westlake heads for street use. Imagine Mustangs making 600 horsepower with bolt-ons. That terrified Ford's marketing department. It could disrupt their performance lineup, undermine their high-performance GTs, Maybe even expose how overbuilt and overpriced their street offerings were. And so, doors closed. Ford didn't ban the 446. They just made life impossible. Testing got delayed. Engine parts went missing. Race budgets were trimmed without explanation. Every road forward was suddenly blocked. There was no smoking gun, no official blacklist. Just funding that vanished, parts that arrived late, phone calls that stopped being returned. Ford didn't have to kill the 446. They just had to starve it. Was it sabotage, strategy, or a slow-motion execution under the banner of corporate preservation? Whatever it was, it worked. And Dan Gurney, the man who dared to dream too big, was left with a masterpiece that no one wanted to show. The 446 didn't die on the track. It died in the shadows, not from failure but from fear. By 1971, development stopped. The three-valve heads were never mass-produced. The dream of dominating IndyCar, Can-Am, even NASCAR was gone. AR quietly pivoted to Chevy power plants. Ford had moved on. But the story didn't end. In garages across America, a few Westlake heads found homes. On drag strips and dynos, the outlaw 446 lived on, beating Corvettes, surprising crowds. One California hot rodder claimed 620 horsepower on pump gas. Another said his Street 446 sounded like a war cry. Collectors whispered about a three-valve prototype sitting in a Texas barn, untouched, waiting. And the legend grew. The Gurney Eagle 446 became a symbol, not just of engineering brilliance, but of what happens when innovation threatens power. A case study in how corporations protect control, how silence can be more lethal than sabotage. Was it too powerful, too advanced, too free? Or was it simply too honest? To this day, no official at Ford has ever publicly explained why the program was ghosted. No apology, no recognition, just the memory of a machine that could have changed everything. Dan Gurney never made a fuss. In a 1990 interview, he just said, "Let's just say they didn't like being shown up," a gentleman's way of saying they buried us. But motorsport remembers. Engineers still marvel at the design. Hot rodders still chase its performance. Documentaries still whisper its name. And those who were there, they talk about the sound, the roar. Because once you've heard the Gurney Eagle 446, really heard it, it never leaves you. So what if it had gone to NASCAR, or Le Mans, or Formula One with a turbo bolted on? What if it had gotten real backing? We'll never know, but what we do know is this. Some engines win trophies, others become legends. The Gurney Eagle 446. It became a ghost that still haunts the suits who buried it. If you enjoyed this ride, through racing's most rebellious engine, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten legends, and keep your ears open. You never know where the next roar might come from.